Okay. Wrong button. Okay, go ahead and start whenever. If you want to, like,
All right.
screen share.
Let me see. Let me see how I screen share here.
Top right. Right
Oh,
next to the
just
link.
the. Okay. um. Okay. All right. You should. Is that it? You see it?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. All right. So I'll just run through it real quick and deliver some comments based on my reading where I think it's useful. But basically, the sort of one-liner is that international politics and political action are defined by great power politics and moral concerns, and there are three types of power or three categories of power that fall in great power politics, and that's military, economic, and power over opinion. And I guess in addition to that, Carr, and I'll get into this in the next section, but it's power over morality, but morality is always at play. So as far as putting him in a paradigm, some of the literature, like they call him a classical realist, and he is mainly writing against the Wilsonian flavor of utopianism that's coming out of the interwar period, League of Nations, and all that. But because he doesn't totally lean on realism, I'd almost put him more towards the English school, or maybe even some would call him a constructivist because of his emphasis on morality's role in political action. And he's also interesting because he's heavily influenced by the thought of Marx and Hegel. So he's kind of adopting their lexicon in places and refuting, or maybe not refuting, but definitely engaging with their arguments. But he's not a Marxist in that he thinks that Marx comes to the wrong conclusion. So the thesis is that the Wilsonian idealism of the interwar period is shown to be inadequate because it neglects the anarchic nature of international politics. And chaos and insecurity prevent the desired international cooperation of the League of Nations. And this is ultimately due to their neglect of the nature of international relations being competitive and the fact that states are trying to survive. So the broad question that he's trying to answer is that he's trying to write a general treatise on the nature of international politics, so the book's very textbook-like, but that it's contextualized in this period of Wilsonian idealism. It's trying to offer a more realistic alternative to that. So he's trying to sort of morph realism with a moral framework that can inspire political action. But again, the balance of power and realist concerns are placed above these moral concerns. So I'll try to go really quick through the chapters that I did. I tried to pick out the most important chapters. So in the preface in chapter 1, we get the end of the traditional power politic international system, where practitioners have been left to their devices. You get the sort of academization of international politics by theorists. They're trying to get rid of things like secret treaties, the old sort of smoke-filled rooms, similar to what Morgenthau talks about. Carr thinks that this is a utopian notion. It's essentially wishful thinking that leads them to take a blind eye to the reality of international politics. On the contrary, realism has what he calls the sufficient humility not to consider itself omnipotent and distinguishes the analysis of what is from what should be. People generally don't want what the idealists are offering, so the publics in these countries, and this is why things like collective security and a world state don't exist. So then, and I'll turn to chapter 6 next. Once idealism has been debunked, this is where he kind of turns into, all right, it can't be total realism. So realism all the way down is what he calls consistent realism. It doesn't possess an adequate positive vision, which leads to political action. So he says that actionable realism needs 4 essential ingredients: a finite goal, an emotional appeal, a right of moral judgment, and a ground for action. So it needs to be able to inspire, which is not like a strictly realist consideration. So he contends that sound political thought must contain these, what he calls them utopian elements or idealistic elements. But he says that utopian visions that are prominent at the time have been co-opted by kleptocrats, and that realism can unmask this. So they interact and balance each other out almost. But consistent realism provides no grounds for cooperation. It's just power struggles all the way down. At this point in the work, Carr doesn't offer a way to resolve the tension here, but suggests that it's cyclical, that movements rise, get hollowed out, become co-opted by kleptocrats, and then realists unmask them, but then the cycle continues. All right, moving on to chapter 7. He offers a definition of politics and his take on social contract theory. He says that politics is the behavior of men in permanent groups. It can't be deduced from people in isolation. So men in groups is his operative definition of society. Man has two postures towards his fellow man in society, which is egoism or getting ahead, and then sociability or cooperation. For society to work, the majority of citizens have to be sociable, but there has to be somebody essentially enforcing the rules. It needs to be government with a monopoly on force. States are held together both by ideals, so a common sense of obligations, but also by a common sense of interests. But behind these are the state's power to enforce obedience to the law. And then that affirms his thesis of you need a mix of realism and idealism / utopianism for a sustainable state. So that's kind of his state level. He's going to try to, or he applies it throughout the work. What's that?
Nothing. I didn't say anything.
Okay. Then move on to chapter 8. Politics is centered around a conflict of power, so that's power politicking in another name. International relations, the power of one state in relation to another principally applies to peer competitors. That's he takes kind of a structural stance on this. Only great powers matter. But he extends this interaction to things like organized labor as well. It's not just states. The Wilsonian liberal utopianism of the interwar period seeks to eliminate power considerations from political actions and to just make it a moral consideration. But Carr thinks that this is a veneer that really just kind of coats the countries who were in control of the League of Nations that the victorious powers of World War I. They're merely just legitimizing their own policies. So he says, to internationalize government means to internationalize power, and international government is in effect government by that state which supplies the power necessary, so that's the victors, for the purpose of governing. And then, again, that takes three forms: military, economic, and control over opinion. So chapter 13, looking at the need for states to be adaptable, because you have to be adaptable to survive. What often happens with states, in his view, is that they become so attached to the status quo that they go down with it when it becomes manifestly inaccurate or inadequate. So he calls that impotency. So what this means for war, and this whole chapter is kind of themed around war and revolution, is that the moral high ground can reside either with defenders or attackers of the status quo. So if the former, the defenders, are propping up a bad system, the moral high ground rests with the revolutionaries. So he talks about that being the case in the American Revolution and then the Irish during the Troubles. He admits that it would be better to have a peaceful change, and admits that revolution is always undesirable in itself, but it's often impossible to avoid violence to achieve political change. And then that every political change is based on a compromise between morality and power, because you have to have a cause to inspire people to take up arms and revolt, but you have to have the means to actually carry out the revolt to be successful. And then the conclusion It addresses the prospects of a new international order emerging in the interwar period. So he talks about the 2 decades of the interwar period. The first one is the Roaring Twenties, super optimistic, but it's been hollowed out, so it comes crashing down. The second decade of the interwar period shows that the substance of the interwar period had decayed. It wasn't rooted in the present. And when it did come down, Europe was confronted with the reality of international politics and that it's an anarchic system composed of mutually exclusive interests. The liberal utopians lost the plot, which allowed for people such as the fascists to rise to power because they could explain and in a way fix the problem at hand. And then this chapter tries to answer the question of whether the nation state will continue to be the principal actor in international politics. And he thinks that it will, but that they will be amalgamated into spheres of influence based on political regimes and economic interests, with a few centers of power being sovereign. So he's pretty much predicting NATO, I think, just and the communist bloc. And this is achieved. These blocks are achieved both through power, so the means to actually enact them, and then the moral justifying story that paints them as tolerant and unoppressive. And then he ends the work by quipping that the League of Nations is inadequate since it has not dug adequate foundations. And then I gave myself a 7 because on the confidence because it seems pretty straightforward what he's saying, and he's kind of in a similar vein to some of the other classical realists. I find him very close to Morgenthau, but maybe a little bit more idealistic. But just I didn't give it like a full 8 or 9, just because I've never read it before, and I don't think it's come up in courses. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Cool. Yeah, that's good. I don't know. Share my screen. Thank you. Window. Okay. Cool. Can you see that? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I mean, it's Mearsheimer. We know. Mearsheimer.
Done.
Yeah. Yeah. Overarching goal of each state is to maximize its share of world power at the expense of other states. So it's like relative power, not absolute power. Great powers seek to become the hegemon. He's very clear throughout that he's talking about great powers. So he doesn't really care about, like, Albania or what they're trying to do. He only cares about great powers. And then he says it's virtually impossible for any state to achieve global hegemony because of the difficulty in projecting power across the world's oceans. But they do attempt to stop other regional hegemons from kind of coming about. So the broad question really is what accounts for great power rise and why do great powers seek to rise? I'm going to change this actually to regional hegemon. Paul says he's still on campus anyway, so.
We go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so chapter 1. I'd probably read chapter 1 and 2, and then chapter 8 and 9, if you wanted to read it. So chapter 1. Kind of going into the structure, one thing that's nice about Mearsheimer is he clearly lays out the assumptions he's making, so that's refreshing. So the structure that he says is why offensive realism is correct, is anarchy, number 1. Number 2, states all have offensive capabilities. 3, states can never be certain of other states' intentions. This is sad. That's why he calls this the tragedy of great power politics. But we should view the world as it is, not as we want it to be. So that's their critique of kind of liberalism, Wilsonianism. And he says there are instances of countries not following offensive realism, but when they do that, they suck at being countries, so they lose. Okay, so chapter 2, states, because of anarchy, attempt to gain hegemony, since that's the only way to ensure their security. He says he critiques Waltz, saying that defensive realists claim that offense doesn't pay, but he says that's false. That offense does pay because you get more resources, and the more resources you have, the more powerful you become. Let's see, introduces offshore balancing in Chapter 2. Nuclear weapons decrease fear. Water, stopping power of water comes out. Bipolarity decreases the amount of fear. Water decreases the amount of fear. And while survival is the primary goal, they may pursue other goals, including economic prosperity ideology. And then world peace cannot occur because states cannot agree on a general formula for peace. And then states will cooperate as long as cooperation doesn't decrease their relative power. Let's see. Chapter 3, states have two types of power, latent and military. So latent is socioeconomic demographics. Military power is hard power. Balance of power is hard power or military power. Chapter 4, basically arguing that land power is the most important part of a country's power because that's the only way you can gain resources is by controlling territory. Air forces and navies can't do that. Independent naval power is unimportant since navies can't project power onto land, blockades don't work, strategic bombing doesn't work, because civilians can endure a lot of pain. Chapter 5, great powers gain power by being wealthy, have large land forces, and have nuclear superiority. Here he gets into the different types of strategies great powers use to rise or to deal with other great powers. So war is the main strategy, but blackmail, so that's like just threatening them. Bait and bleed is where they provoke a war between two rivals. Bloodletting is using, like, making the war more deadly than it needs to be. For example, well, I guess I'll go through kind of examples as I think of them after I go through it. But appeasement and bandwagoning don't work very well. And then states have 4 goals: regional hegemony, maximizing share of world's wealth, becoming the preeminent land power, and gaining nuclear superiority. So war, example, we know war. Blackmail is like when North Korea will always threaten to bomb us whenever they want a deal. Bait and bleed, so that's provoking a war between two rivals. That one, Mearsheimer says, is like the best, but it's very difficult to actually have happen because you have to convince two countries to go to war against each other and not go to war against you. And so like an example of that probably would be like the Iran-Iraq war. And bloodletting, so probably an example of that is like us with Ukraine and Russia. So we're using the Ukrainian war to bloodlet Russia, but we don't, but there's other things that could be said about that too. But I won't say them. Chapter 6, History of Great Power, Rise and Fall. Now you can skip it. Chapter 7 covers another history of offshore balancers. So offshore balancing is an island country that will balance on in another region, or force balancing on another region. So supporting the weaker side in any sort of competition or conflict. And I did note that he references E.H. Carr in this chapter, saying that Carr was warning his citizens about excessive idealism. Chapter 8, balancing always occurs in a bipolar system, buck passing usually in a multipolar system, although it kind of depends on if it's an unbalanced multipolar system or a balanced multipolar system. So in a unbalanced multipolar system, the great powers will balance against the stronger, but then in a balanced multipolar system, they'll buck pass. So it's a little bit confusing there. And unbalanced and balanced multipolar is there kind of a parity between all of the great powers in their relative power. That would be a balanced multipolar system. and an unbalanced multipolar system is that there's one more powerful great power that the other ones will all try to, in this case, this is why he says that they balance. So the example of that is like the Nazi Germany was an unbalanced multipolar system because the Nazis had so much more power than any of the other countries. But in World War I would probably be a balanced multipolar system because all the great powers were generally of the same relative power to each other. Let's see, Chapter 9, Anarchy alone cannot describe why states go to war. So then he goes through kind of what increases the likelihood. So multipolarity, because there are, he calls them more potential conflict dyads, which is kind of a confusing term, but what he means by that is just there's like more pairings that can go to war with each other. And so there's more room for different alliances in that war. So that increases the chance. A greater imbalance of power increases the chance, and when there's more potential for miscalculation. The multipolarity is the most dangerous because of conflict dyads, imbalances of power, and potential for miscalculation. And then Chapter 10, he goes over like the chance for a U.S.-China war, and he essentially just says it's more likely than a Soviet-U.S. war because it ticks all of the boxes of Chapter 9. Then I also gave it a 7. I mean, probably do an 8, but nah. So that's Mearsheimer there.
Yeah, that's good.
Cool. I don't think I have much in terms of questions. I don't know about you for Mearsheimer.
No, not really. I think I know what he says, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
All right, cool.
Cool.
I'll talk to you soon then.
All right, see you in a bit.